It started with grief, or at least that is how Candace Owens described it in the early weeks, as something that felt like loyalty to a friend, an inability to accept the speed with which the people around Charlie Kirk had moved from mourning to management. She had worked alongside Charlie at Turning Point USA from 2017 to 2019. She had built her national platform in significant part through the visibility that association gave her. She was the godmother of one of Charlie's children, and she sat watching the 10 days following his assassination on September 10, 2025, with a specific, documented discomfort that she was not willing to keep private. That discomfort became one of the most sustained, most viral, most divisive, and most legally contested one-person investigative operations in the history of conservative media. It became 40-plus podcast episodes. It became a 6 million subscriber YouTube channel. It became a formal investigative series called Bride of Charlie. It became a defamation lawsuit from Charlie's head of security. It became cease and desist letters from Erika Kirk's legal team. It became Ben Shapiro publicly calling her evil. It became Tim Pool publicly accusing her of doing more damage to Charlie's legacy than anyone else alive. It became the most visible and most consequential fault line running through the American right in the year following Charlie Kirk's attack. And it has not stopped. As of July 2026, more than 10 months after Charlie was unalived, Candace Owens is still publishing, still investigating, still telling her audience that the full story of September 10th, 2025 has not been told, and a significant and growing portion of the conservative media ecosystem is still watching every single episode. This is the story of how Bride of Charlie came to be, what it has actually documented, what it has claimed that cannot be verified, what it has gotten wrong, and why it has proved impossible to shut down. The first public indication that Owens was going to take the Erika Kirk question somewhere nobody else was willing to go came in October 2025, just weeks after Charlie's assassination. On her podcast, she began asking questions about the succession, specifically about the audio recording in which Charlie allegedly named Erika as his chosen successor to lead Turning Point USA in the event of his passing. Owens described the audio as sounding wrong to her. She described the speed of the board vote, 8 days from assassination to CEO appointment, as unseemly. She asked publicly why Turning Point USA would not release the underlying video from the Aspen donor retreat where the succession statement was allegedly made. Those were measured, specific investigative questions. They were the kind of questions that any journalist covering a major organizational succession would ask. And they were met with what Owens described as immediate and organized pushback from inside Turning Point USA, specifically from Andrew Colvett, who began posting clips of Owens's content labeled as false, absolute lies, and garbage without providing the specific factual rebuttals that would have answered her specific questions. That specific asymmetry, Owens asking specific questions, Colvett providing general dismissals, was itself what Owens began to document and amplify. The pattern of dismissal without rebuttal is real and is confirmed by multiple independent observers who have reviewed both sides of the exchange. Whether the pattern reflects guilt or simply an organization that has decided its spokesperson's time is better spent on other things than playing whack-a-mole with a hostile podcast host is a question that each viewer ultimately answers for themselves. By November 2025, Owens was describing her growing suspicions not just about the succession, but about what she called the circumstances surrounding Charlie's attack itself. She said she had begun to believe that Charlie had been betrayed by people close to him. She said she was no longer confident that Tyler Robinson had acted entirely alone. She said she believed the speed of the official narrative, the the rapid arrest, the rapid succession, the rapid organizational transition, was itself a signal that someone wanted the story closed before it was fully examined. Those were significant escalations from asking about the succession video, and they were met with significantly escalated responses from inside the conservative media ecosystem. On December 15, 2025, the meeting happened. Megyn Kelly had been in private communication with both women for weeks, and she facilitated a 4.5-hour private meeting in Nashville between Erika Kirk and Candace Owens. The Hollywood Reporter, in its March 5, 2026, investigation into the Bride of Charlie series, described Kelly as having brokered the meeting. Not simply facilitated or encouraged, but actively arranged. Both women confirmed the meeting on X the same evening, both using the word productive. The piece lasted approximately 12 hours. The following morning, Owens opened her podcast with the words, 4.5 hours later, I'm alive. I'm alive. By the end of that week, she had published leaked audio from a Turning Point USA staff Zoom call, captured approximately 11 days after Charlie's passing. Audio in which a woman identified as Erika discussed merchandise sales figures and described Charlie's memorial as the event of the century. The Zoom call audio was one of the most consequential pieces of content Owens had released to that point. Radar Online and the Irish Star both confirmed and covered it. The specific detail that spread most widely was the merchandise revenue discussion and the celebratory tone, described by critics as jarring for a call, taking place 11 days after the assassination of the organization's founder. But it was the trailer for Bride of Charlie, released on February 23, 2026, that transformed the conflict from a podcast-level dispute into a nationally covered story. Owens dropped the trailer on her X account, over 5 million subscribers and growing rapidly, with a brief note saying the series would premiere February 25th. The trailer used dramatic clips from news coverage of the attack, leaked audio from Turning Point USA internal calls, and shadowy visual editing that critics immediately described as deliberately sensationalistic. The title itself, a play on Bride of Chucky, was characterized by multiple commentators as a jab at Erika's marriage and her rapid ascent to CEO. The response from the conservative establishment was immediate and unified in its condemnation. Ben Shapiro posted on X with the single line, "Candace Owens is evil." That post was retweeted extensively. Tim Pool described her as doing more damage to Charlie's legacy than anyone else in public life. The Washington Post coverage called her a conspiracy theorist. Michelle Goldberg in the New York Times called her the conservative movement's Frankenstein monster. Even within the same week as the trailer's release, Erika's camp began pursuing cease and desist options against Owens. The Bride of Charlie series itself, which the Washington Post described as delivering little in the way of concrete allegations in its first episode, built across multiple installments toward increasingly specific claims. Owens presented what she described as documented evidence of Erika's location on September 10th at an unmarked building in Scottsdale, associated with a luxury aircraft brokerage called Hopkinson Aircraft, rather than the treatment center parking lot Erika described in her Fox News interview with Jesse Waters. Owens questioned why Andrew Colvette was flying in from Santa Barbara on the day of the assassination, rather than being in proximity to a major Turning Point USA event. She examined the Mikey McCoy call log timeline, sourced to Turning Point USA's own provided records, showing that the first call McCoy made after Charlie was unalived was to his wife Elizabeth, not to Erika, contradicting Blake Neff's public account. She flagged the Tyler Bauer camera shutdown tweet, which claimed cameras were switched off immediately on police orders, as contradicted by footage in her possession showing 4 minutes of continued filming after the attack. Some of those claims are independently verifiable. The call log discrepancy is specifically documented, sourced to Turning Point USA's own records, and has never been directly denied with specificity. The camera shutdown contradiction between Bauer's tweet and the footage Owens described is specific and documented. The ATF inconclusive ballistics finding is a confirmed court record. The DINA multiple contributors finding is confirmed. The succession video sourced from ActCon 2023, rather than the claimed Aspen meeting, is confirmed by community notes and independent fact-checkers. Others are not independently verified. The Hopkinson aircraft location claim has not been confirmed by any independent major news organization. The Santa Barbara Colvette claim has not been independently verified. The specific attribution of coordination or foreknowledge to Erika Kirk has no verified documentary basis. The Hollywood Reporter's March 5th investigation noted directly that the FBI has presented no evidence of a broader conspiracy in the Kirk attack. Factually, independent fact checks of the series found that multiple news outlets and opinion pieces reviewing Bride of Charlie conclude the core insinuations and conspiratorial connections Owens advances lack supporting evidence. Owens's response to those assessments has been consistent. The FBI's absence of evidence of a broader conspiracy is not the same as evidence of no broader conspiracy. And the outlets dismissing her work are the same institutional media outlets whose credibility she has been questioning for years. There were elements of the Bride of Charlie investigation that crossed into territory that this report cannot amplify, and that Owens herself has in some cases acknowledged as speculative or sourced from unreliable informants. The Egyptian military aircraft tracking theory, which Owens presented in November 2025 and attributed to what she called a pregnant mommy sleuth who was locked into this investigation and who had emailed her, was covered by Radar Online and described even in sympathetic coverage as a wild new conspiracy theory. Owens acknowledged the source herself on air, a viewer email. She presented it anyway. The first episode of Bride of Charlie ended with what Owens described as a major discovery about Erika's childhood schooling, connecting the school to a Wrinkle in Time-themed education project, and then linking that through a chain of institutional names to powerful families and controversial corporate history. A summary of that episode by Newsworthy Women. Com described the chain as running from school name to institutional connection to a broader theory about elite networks. Independent reviewers found the chain of inference too attenuated to support the conclusions Owens drew from it. These are the elements of the Bride of Charlie investigation that critics like Ben Shapiro, Tim Pool, The Hollywood Reporter, and The Washington Post point to when they describe Owens as a conspiracy theorist who has abandoned evidence standards in pursuit of an agenda. Those criticisms are not entirely unfair. There are documented instances within the series where Owens moved from documented questions to unverified conclusions faster than the evidence warranted. But the specific irony of the conservative establishment's rejection of Owens's investigation is this. The same figures who are calling her evil and accusing her of making things up are the ones who have never provided the specific documentary answers to the specific documentary questions she initially raised. The succession video is still sourced from a 2023 event. The Aspen donors who dispute the succession story have still not been publicly addressed. The call log discrepancy between Neff's account and McCoy's documented call sequence has still not been explained. The camera shutdown contradiction between Bauer's tweet and the footage timeline has still not been explained. And the authenticated text messages in which Charlie described being bullied by donors into positions he rejected, confirmed by Colvette himself, have never been addressed by Erika directly. Owens raised those questions first, before she moved into theory and speculation, and those questions are still legitimate and still unanswered, regardless of how far the series subsequently traveled from documented evidence into speculative territory. The legal dimension of the Bride of Charlie saga is the most recently evolved element and the one with the most immediate practical consequences for Owens. Brian Harpole, Charlie's head of security, filed a defamation lawsuit against Owens on April 30th, 2026. Confirmed by Radar Online and Barrett Media. The suit contests Owens' specific public statements about Harpole's behavior on the day of the attack, her drone allegations, and the Fort Huachuca claims. The lawsuit has not yet gone to trial. Owens has described the suit as an attempt to intimidate her into silence. Erika Kirk's legal team has also been active in sending cease and desist correspondence related to specific claims Owens has made in the series. Owens published her response to Erika's cease and desist in characteristic fashion, publicly on her podcast, while describing the letter as evidence that she was getting close to something important. The response itself became one of the most quoted moments of the series. The legal pressure has not stopped Owens from publishing. It has, if anything, provided additional narrative fuel for each subsequent episode. Every cease and desist becomes evidence of what she describes as an organization trying to suppress honest investigation. Every lawsuit becomes documentation of whose name appears in the legal filings. The pressure to silence her has, in the specific information environment she operates in, functioned as amplification rather than suppression. What would actually stop Bride of Charlie is a specific, documented, publicly verifiable resolution of the questions at its core. If Turning Point USA released the original, unedited Aspen footage showing Charlie naming Erika as his successor, and if that footage were independently verified as authentic, the foundational question of the series would be answered. If Erika provided a specific, documented, verifiable account of her exact location and activities on September 10th, 2025, that could be independently confirmed. The alibi question would be answered. If the succession video had been from the Aspen meeting rather than from ActCon 2023, the ActCon controversy would not exist. None of those resolutions have been provided. And so Owens keeps publishing. Her subscriber count on YouTube, which stood at 5 million when the Bride of Charlie trailer dropped in February 2026, had grown to 6 million by The Hollywood Reporter's March 5th coverage. Whatever the series has gotten wrong, and it has gotten things wrong, it has done so in front of an audience that has been consistently growing rather than shrinking. The September 1st, 2026, oral arguments before Judge Tony Graff will be the next major legal milestone. If Graff finds probable cause and the case moves to trial, the evidentiary picture that Owens has been building publicly, the ATF inconclusive finding, the DINA multiple contributors, the call log discrepancy, the camera shutdown timeline, will encounter the adversarial legal system and be tested in ways that podcast investigation cannot replicate. Whether that process produces outcomes that vindicate or contradict Owens's theory is a question that remains genuinely open. What is documented from every direction and every perspective on this story is this: the investigation Candace Owens launched in October 2025 into the circumstances of Charlie Kirk's assassination and the legitimacy of Erika Kirk's succession has become the most significant, most sustained, and most consequential piece of independent conservative media investigation in recent memory, in ways that neither its creator nor its subjects fully anticipated when it began. Charlie Kirk once said, with characteristic directness, "If the other side is trying to silence you, you are doing something right." Candace Owens keeps repeating that line, and in the specific context of this specific story, it lands differently every time she does. The deeper context of why this investigation landed with such force requires understanding the unique position Candace Owens occupied inside the conservative media ecosystem long before September 10, 2025. She was never a conventional institutional player. Her rise was built on a combination of sharp cultural critique, willingness to break with orthodoxy on race and gender issues, and an early alliance with Turning Point USA that gave her access to campus audiences and donor networks she could not have reached alone. That alliance ended years before Charlie's death, yet the residual loyalty she publicly claimed, godmother status, shared history, personal affection, gave her early questions a moral weight that pure outsiders lacked. When she began asking about the Succession audio, she was not a random conspiracy content creator fishing for clicks. She was someone who had sat in the same rooms, met the same donors, and watched the same organizational dynamics. That history made the silence from Turning Point more conspicuous, not less. Every general dismissal from Colvett or other spokespeople was read by her audience against the backdrop of her prior access. The absence of a detailed rebuttal with timestamps, donor names, or unedited video was interpreted not as strategic restraint, but as evidentiary vacuum. The speed of the organizational transition itself became a central motif. 8 days from the assassination to the board's formal appointment of Erika as CEO is, by any nonprofit governance standard, extraordinarily rapid. Succession plans exist precisely so that organizations can move quickly in crisis, yet the public presentation of that plan rested on a single piece of audio whose provenance remained contested. Owens's insistence that the audio sounded wrong was subjective, but her demand for the original video was not. Independent verification of the Succession claim would have required either the Aspen footage or sworn statements from the donors present. Neither was produced. In the absence of those materials, Owens's audience filled the gap with suspicion. The pattern repeated across every subsequent claim. A specific, documentable discrepancy is raised. A general denial or silence follows. The discrepancy is then amplified as evidence of larger concealment. This dynamic is not unique to Bride of Charlie, but the emotional stakes, Charlie's memory, Erika's widowhood, the future of a major conservative institution, raised the temperature far beyond ordinary media feuds. The December 15th Nashville meeting facilitated by Megyn Kelly remains one of the more unusual episodes in recent conservative media history. 4.5 hours is not a brief courtesy conversation. Both women emerged using the word productive, yet within 12 hours, Owens was back on air declaring survival, and within days releasing internal Zoom audio that portrayed Erika discussing merchandise and memorial logistics in tones that many listeners found jarring. The release of that audio crossed a line for many in the movement. Private organizational conversations captured shortly after a founder's violent death are rarely flattering when made public. The decision to publish them was framed by Owens as transparency, and by her critics as betrayal of a grieving family's privacy. The Hollywood Reporter's later characterization of Kelly as having brokered, rather than merely facilitated the meeting, added another layer of institutional intrigue. Whether Kelly intended the meeting to de-escalate or simply to gather information remains unknown. What is documented is that any temporary tente collapsed almost immediately. The February trailer for Bride of Charlie marked the point at which the conflict escaped the relatively contained world of podcasts and X threads and entered mainstream coverage. The visual language, news footage of the attack intercut with shadowy graphics and the title's horror movie illusion, was designed for maximum emotional impact. Critics across the spectrum, from Shapiro to the Washington Post to the New York Times, treated the trailer as evidence of bad faith. Yet the same trailer drove subscriber growth and episode viewership into the millions. The first episode's focus on Erika's childhood schooling and attenuated institutional links was widely panned as conspiratorial overreach. Yet subsequent episodes returned repeatedly to the more concrete discrepancies: the call logs, the camera timeline, the succession video source. That oscillation between verifiable anomalies and speculative chains is the series' defining structural feature. Viewers who came for the unanswered questions stayed for the accumulating atmosphere of distrust. Critics who dismissed the speculation often declined to engage the residual documentary gaps. The legal pressure that followed did not resolve those gaps. Brian Herpol's April 2026 defamation suit focuses on specific statements Owens made about security failures and alleged drone activity on the day of the attack. Erika's legal team's cease and desist letters targeted particular biographical and locational claims. Owens treated both as confirmation rather than constraint. In the information environment she inhabits, formal legal threats are converted into content. The letter is read on air. The lawsuit is framed as an attempt to protect a narrative, and the next episode proceeds. This feedback loop is self-reinforcing. The more pressure applied, the more her audience interprets the pressure as evidence that the questions matter. The more the questions remain unanswered with primary documents, the more the pressure appears justified to her critics. Neither side has broken the cycle. Independent assessments of the series, including those published by The Hollywood Reporter and various fact-checking outlets, consistently note the absence of evidence for any coordinated conspiracy involving Erika Kirk or Turning Point USA personnel in the assassination itself. The FBI has presented no such evidence. Court records regarding the ballistics and DNA findings remain matters of public record, and do not, on their face, establish multiple perpetrators. Yet the same assessments often concede that several of the narrower process questions, the exact provenance of the succession audio, the precise sequence of post-attack calls, the camera operation timeline, have not been fully resolved in public. That residual ambiguity is the fuel. As long as it persists, Owens can continue to argue that institutional media and movement leaders are prioritizing narrative closure over transparency. As long as she continues to interleave that argument with speculative leaps, her critics can continue to dismiss the entire project as reckless. The growth of her audience through the spring and summer of 2026 demonstrates that a substantial segment of the conservative public remains receptive to the project. Subscriber numbers moved from 5 million at the trailer's release to 6 million within weeks and have continued climbing. Episode view counts in the low millions for later installments indicate sustained rather than purely viral interest. Whether that audience is primarily seeking answers, seeking validation of distrust in institutions, or simply consuming high-drama content is an open sociological question. What is not open is the fact that the series has become a permanent feature of the post-Kirk conservative landscape. It has forced other media figures to take sides, strained relationships inside Turning Point USA's orbit, and kept a set of process questions in continuous circulation long after most organizations would have preferred them closed. Looking ahead to the September 2026 court proceedings, the adversarial process may finally force a more rigorous testing of the claims Owens has advanced. Discovery, cross-examination, and evidentiary standards differ sharply from podcast narrative construction. Documents that have not been released publicly may surface. Witnesses who have declined to engage on social media may be compelled to answer under oath. The outcome of that process, whether it narrows the residual ambiguities or expands them, will shape the next phase of the story. Until then, the investigation continues in the only venue where it has so far been allowed to proceed without institutional interruption: Owens' his own platform. Episode after episode, in front of an audience that shows no sign of fatigue. Charlie Kirk's assassination was a singular trauma for the American right. The speed with which the organization he built moved to stabilize itself under new leadership was, to many, a necessary act of institutional self-preservation. To Candace Owens and the audience that has followed her through 40-plus episodes, that same speed looked like something else. The resulting conflict has revealed fault lines that predated September 10, 2025, tensions over donor influence, succession norms, media accountability, and the boundaries of acceptable inquiry inside a movement that prizes both loyalty and skepticism. Those fault lines have not closed. The questions that launched Bride of Charlie remain, in significant part, unanswered with primary documentation. Whether keeping those questions alive constitutes public service or public harm continues to divide the very people who once shared the same stages, the same donors, and the same cause. The series itself shows no indication of ending. And as long as the core documentary gaps persist, the energy that has sustained it shows no indication of dissipating.